Call Deputy Clare Daly.
Thanks, Ceann Comhairle. And I think we can look at any situation and analyse it from the point of view of whether the glass is half empty or half full. And there's no doubt that many deputies have largely welcomed the bill. I think it will obviously be broadly supported. But you'd have to say that it is incredibly limited in its cover and in terms of what it's providing to do. And I do think we need to look in a little bit more depth. I think the critical absence from the bill has obviously been highlighted already. The gaping hole that we have, the biggest issue of concern that the Private Residential Tenancy Board deals with, the complex issues of, on the one hand, in relation to tenants' rights, the issue of deposits being withheld, and from a landlord's point of view, the rent being unpaid. They are the two significant contributors to the cases that are with the PRTB, but they are precisely the two areas that are excluded from this legislation. And I note, obviously, that the Minister has said that this will be addressed later on. But to me, that's the wrong way around. And I think for this bill to be comprehensive, adding it in later on really isn't adequate. And we need to examine that, because we're saying that this legislation is going to reduce delays. It's going to simplify procedures in terms of disputes between landlords and tenants, and who is going to stand up and say that's a bad thing? Of course, that is a good thing, but we have to look at what mechanisms are being put in place to actually make that a reality. And I think when you look at the statistics and the actual situation on the ground, you'd have to say that what you're trying to do is square a circle, and unless the resources are being put in, we can't deliver on it. And actually, we're not in any way contributing to improving the situation, because we've seen the statistics. The number of applications of cases before the board are over 2,000, 2,230, which the board itself has said in the last year is a 20% unprecedented rise in cases that they are dealing with. We've had the points highlighted by other deputies. The waiting time is 8 to 12 months. And yet, under the government moratorium on recruitment, public sector embargo and all, that the numbers in that organisation are due to fall from 70 staff to 33. So how are they going to deal against a backdrop of more applications with less staff to provide the efficient type service which the bill itself claims that it is going to deliver? So it sounds good, but in actual fact, what's going on behind the scenes would lead you to believe that the situation is going to get worse. When you look as well at the fact that we are increasing the scope of the board to extend cover for voluntary and cooperative housing, and most deputies have welcomed that. Well, I'm not so sure, to be honest. I have no problem with them being included, but I think we need to look a lot more. We need to dig deeper in terms we're going with, where are we going with social housing policy in Ireland, because there's been an absolute explosion of these voluntary and cooperative bodies, while at the same time there's been an erosion of local authority provision. And is it really necessary that we need hundreds of these voluntary housing organisations? I'm not so sure, to be honest, that it is. So these are some of the background issues that I think that the Minister has to resolve before I would be thinking that this legislation is going to deliver any meaningful change. Now, I think it's correct, as people have done a little, to step back from the situation and look at the nature of accommodation provision in Ireland. And I think we'd probably have to say that we are in a kind of a peculiar hybrid type situation, whereby, on the one hand, there has been a total explosion of rented properties. Now, rented properties and rack renting, slum owning landlords of James Connolly's time are not something new to this country. But the landlord of today is actually very different than the traditional landlord who played that role. We've had many people who are involuntary landlords, who in actual fact they're a landlord by virtue of the fact that their home, which they bought at the height of the boom, for an exorbitant price, which they haven't been able to continue to meet the mortgage repayments. Many of them have ended up having to move out of their home, go back and live with their parents or share with somebody else, and they're merely renting the property to try and cover and repay a mortgage, an unsustainable mortgage, to give the bank its money. And in many cases, the rent isn't even enough for that. They're making up the deficit in that regard. We've had many retired people who bought property and were encouraged to buy property, particularly if they were in the private sector with an inadequate pension fund, asked to invest their money in that, and again, their hard-earned life savings are going to boost the mortgage repayment. It's not in any way contributing to their pension, it's a liability. So, you know, they're not renting to profit, and we need to examine that. And to me, many of these involuntary landlords are something that we need decisive action on, because what's the benefit of that? And what is the benefit of the state, in many instances, paying rent subsidy towards the private rental of those properties with unsecured tenure? And there should be, in my opinion, some sort of a scheme whereby the government would take over those mortgages on the basis of much of the debt being written off, to be honest. The banks have been compensated for that, but those people should be allowed get out of those contracts. And to me, it would be a vehicle for how the state could actually become the landlord and be a direct provision of social housing, which would be actually a much better way of resolving disputes, because contrary to what people think, in many ways the estate management and tenant resolution process is far easier within the scope of direct provision within the local authorities itself. They're in a much better position to deal with these issues than the private sector itself. And I do think that, you know, this bill has to be seen in that context, that we have a new type of landlord. It's not the same as it was before, but also we have the virtual collapse of social housing provision. It's just not happening. There is no houses being built and no NAMA properties really being transferred into the ownership of the local authorities. The best that's on offer at the moment is this idea of long-term leasing, where the local authorities or tenant engage in a 10-year lease, which to me is an absolute joke, that the local authorities are taking over these properties, paying rent on them for 10 years, probably 20 years. They are responsible for the full maintenance of those properties, and at the end of that, they hand them back to the person who owned them, who probably has, you know, profited a fair bit in that time, and the person who was living in it, who thought it was their home, doesn't have any huge security other than the obligation of that local authority to rehouse them somewhere else. It does undermine the idea of a home. I think there has been the explosion of the RAS properties, where people rent properties for a 5-year period. Is that better than what went before? Absolutely. It's far better than what went before in terms of the rent supplement situation, the fact that the rent is calculated as if it were a council house. The person can take up gainful employment if the opportunity arises. If by some miracle they manage to get a job in this country, they could actually take it up and pay higher rent, but they wouldn't lose all their benefits the way they used to under the old situation. Is that better? Yes, it is. But is it really an adequate security of tenure? Not really, because that person is at the whim, ultimately, if the landlord wants to sell the house, if they can't make changes to it. And there are broader issues there that I really think need more discussion and more thought. Now, I think, you know, in some ways the debate can appear to be a little bit contradictory, in that I think everybody would agree that we need more protection for landlords. I appreciate that, and we need more protection for tenants. And how do you balance the two rights, particularly when they conflict? And that's not an easy issue to deal with. I'm not sure that the legislation does it or is going to be able to do it. Obviously, you know, we've made the point about many cases, and we all would have experienced them as public reps, of tenants whose deposit is withheld for the most ridiculous of reasons, for basic wear and tear in a property that the landlord is absolutely lawfully responsible for, and they just chance their arm, withhold the deposit, which makes it very difficult for that person to move on, particularly if they've got money from the health board or whatever. There are issues around that. They can't get a second instalment of a deposit. They can't move on. Horrendous situation, which really needs to be addressed. There's no doubt about that. On the other side, landlords are in a very difficult situation. And, you know, I had one case of a couple which I'll highlight, because I think it does give an example of how we're talking about a different type of landlord and how the pressures that people come on, and where they do interface with the PRTB as it stands now. Well, their experience hasn't been adequate. So if we're looking at legislation to improve that, then we need to look at the bigger picture. Now, this couple were self-employed, they were small business people, and then their business dried up. Obviously, with the recession, no more work there, they had to shut their business down. They had a second home as an investment, a second property, as they said, but a big mortgage on it. Because they've been self-employed and had a business, they had no right to social welfare entitlements, and were actually living off the rent of the second property, really as their main source of income. They registered with the PRTB, as a good landlord should, had paid their money and registered, did everything by the book. Towards early on last year, the tenant started to fall behind on the rent, was paying less and less, and then by the middle of the year actually stopped paying the rent, full stop. They were getting totally nothing, and they were owed at this point in time absolutely thousands of euros, 6,000 to 7,000 euros. They had served the tenant with all of the notices, did everything by the book that the PRTB told them. The tenant was supposed to vacate the premises. They didn't. They changed the locks, and the people contacted the PRTB and asked for assistance from the dispute resolution service, but were told, well, sorry about that now. We know you did register with us, but you didn't register with us again, and you're supposed to do that after a certain period in time. You let that lapse. Now, they weren't aware of that, they hadn't been informed of that, and when they subsequently, despite being owed thousands of euros in rent, went to try and get assistance from the board in terms of the dispute resolution process, they were told, we can't even look at this now until you give us another 180 euros, and even if you do give us the money, then we can't say that, even though now 9 months have passed already since this tenant stopped paying you the full amount of rent, we can't guarantee you when that case will be heard. These are people who have no income, virtually, a couple in later years in life with no income, and really would probably have to sell the house to realise anything at this stage. And I think it does give you a bit of a glimpse of the complexities around this issue. And the idea, which is a very good thing on paper, and all of us would support the idea of tenants being protected from unscrupulous landlords. There's no question about that. But the very fact that we have measures in place which say that somebody, the contract can't be terminated pending an appeal to the board, that people are waiting 12 months and they're left with somebody in situ in their property. The person in situ knows that they can get away basically rent-free for months while this process has been weighed, and the huge financial hardship on people like the couple I mentioned. So what is a protective measure for the tenant has become a real source of coercion for the landlord in that case, and it is clearly very unfair in that instance, and we do need a better balance. And I'm not sure that the bill as it's structured, but particularly, to be honest, the PRTB itself, the way it's structured, can actually deliver on that, because even the good objectives of this bill can't be delivered if that board doesn't have the staff. If we don't have a criteria in it which says, do you know what, a month, case should be dealt with in a month. So that does mean actually an investment and more resources going in. But if we're serious about tenants' rights and landlords' rights and improving the situation for both, well, then we have no choice. We have to do it. But I'd go back to the point I made at the start, that we probably are looking at this whole debate the wrong way around, in my opinion, because what it is indicative of is really, in many ways, the sort of creeping privatisation of social housing stock. And I think it's wrong to move away from direct provision of housing, which was the norm years ago and now doesn't happen at all, creates all sorts of problems, all sorts of bureaucracies, and that is the elephant in the room. We've had an explosion of voluntary housing bodies, 700 of them, in a country the size of Ireland, managing 25,000 units. Now, I know some of them are only for one dwelling here and there, they're very, very minor and so on. But the idea of saying that extending this type of control is a good thing, well, I'm not sure it is. Why do we need all these separate housing organisations with their own directors and their own management teams and their own offices and their own bureaucracy and administration duplicating itself, when in actual fact we have 34 local authorities with fully trained staff who know housing issues, who have experience over decades, who can deal with a lot of these issues. And it is like, privatising that situation and saying that these bodies, which are, not for profit and all the rest, but each one of them now is going to be charged €90 to register with the PRTB. Let's be clear about it. They aren't going to pay that. They've got no money. So it's going to be the tenant in that property who's going to end up paying. The same tenant who's going to have to end up paying for the property tax, because those houses are included in the property tax, which is going to be a couple of hundred, when we know the statistics already about rent arrears. So we're putting huge onerous pressure on tenants, nearly almost making it inevitable that they'll fall behind in their rent, when we know that half the families in this state have only €50 a month left when they meet their basic expenses. De facto, we're adding on between those measures huge amounts of extra rent, making it more likely that these precise people are going to end up in front of the PRTB because, do you know what, they can't pay their rent either. So we do need to stand back for that and look that we are relying on the private sector too much. Now, I'm aware, as I said, that many of the not traditional landlord, the new type, needs people in their houses to repay that mortgage, but that's an unsustainable situation, and it is linked to the overall mortgage crisis and the failure of the banks, despite being compensated, to write down those mortgages and deal with those properties in negative equity where people can't cope. So we need an initiative, in my mind, that those people who are just keeping those houses going and just acting as a landlord simply to pay the banks can go into another process where they can get out of being, where they can hand back that property without being left still owing the banks loads of money, and that they can get on with their lives. They never wanted to be a landlord, but who's going to step into the vacuum? And the only people who can do that is, to my mind, the state in the form of the local authorities. But it does mean the banks paying their part as well and accepting the fact that they were compensated by this taxpayer already to the tune of billions, and part of that was about writing down unsustainable mortgages. That has to be added in. We do need to take what's best in terms of international experience, in terms of issues of security of tenure, where in countries like France people are provided with a security whereby if they're rented, it's really sort of, if it's their main residence, then their rights are akin to the rights of a home owner. And that's what we need to do. We're not talking about houses, which is just bricks and mortar and a bit of furniture. We're talking about people's homes, people's lives, their ability to raise their families in decency and so on. And that does mean rights and responsibilities on both sides, absolutely, for sure. But I do think that we probably are looking at it maybe slightly the wrong way around. So, look, nobody's going to oppose this bill. It is going to go through to the next stage. I'm glad that the Minister has said that the issues of the rent arrears and the deposit retention will be addressed later on, hopefully before it goes to final conclusion. That will be an assist for sure. It represents 50% of the caseload of the PRTB. So unless we come up with an easier, seamless mechanism for dealing with these issues, then the rest of the bill is definitely not going to be able to implement the objectives that it is. We may consider looking at some amendments around the voluntary housing issue for the reasons that I said. I'm not fully comfortable with that, because de facto it is going to move the cost onto the shoulders of tenants who can't deal with it. But I am glad that we're beginning to discuss these issues in more detail, but I do think that it needs to be supplemented by a broader discussion on direct provision of social housing in the manner in which we did previously. We're not talking about having to go around and build the houses, but some mechanism for maybe where the state could take them over and run them more efficiently than is presently being done.